And we want to welcome you and thank you for coming this afternoon and joining us for this talk. My name is Stephanie Norby and I'm the director of the Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies, and I'm proud to introduce the second lecture in the Good series for the year 2007. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge a couple people from our office, the Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies, and that's Bruce Craig, who's the Director of Evaluation in our office, and also Pino Monaco, and both of them are responsible for putting the program together today, so thank you. I'd also like to welcome our virtual participants in this conference. I know that we have many people who are joining us today from our affiliate museums across the country and even from museums internationally. So welcome, and we're glad that you were able to join us. And if you could tell your colleagues who are unable to join us while this webinar is going on, that today's session, along with others in the Good Lecture series, are archived on museumstudies.si.edu. That's museumstudies, one word, .si.edu. And you can go to that and you can replay it, or you can look at earlier lectures that have been offered through this series. This series is named after George Brown Goode, who had a long career here at the Smithsonian. He was here for 26 years as a curator, an assistant director, and eventually as an assistant secretary, and was responsible for the museum now that we call the Arts and Industries Building. Not only did he have a long tenure here, but he was a leader not only at the Smithsonian, but in the field itself in making education central to that. And that's why this series is named after him. The purpose of the series is for us to foster discussion and awareness of the research that is out in the field so that we're able to improve our practice. And I know, because I've had a chance at lunch today to visit with our two presenters, that it's going to be a very interesting and engaging presentation. The theme for this year in the presentations was Forces Shaping the Future of Museums. And many of you probably joined us for the first in that series, which was offered by Dr. Maxwell Anderson, and it was on technology and using technology to make the work of museums visible, how we can share information and make our work transparent. Today our focus is going to be on an important topic, and a topic that's lively now at the Smithsonian, and that's about learning. We have a new secretary, Secretary Clough, and he has already stated in his installation speech that education is one of the three areas that he wants to focus on. And that stimulated a lot of discussion across the institution about what does education mean. And I think that's been a rich discussion, and I know that the presentations will contribute to it today. But today we're going to focus really not just on education, but on learning. And what is the difference between learning and education? And what is it that people actually learn when they come to exhibitions? And to what degree is that constructed by the museum? And to what degree is that constructed by the individual learner themselves? And we're going to look at that through two different windows of research. One that's looking through what we know about adult learners, and another looking at the kinds of interactions that actually happen in galleries. After those two presentations, we're going to then open it up to discussion and questions and talk about how we can put this research into practice. So now I'd like to introduce our two presenters. Our first presenter is Colette Dufresne-Tassé, and she's sitting right here to her left. And Colette comes to us with rich experience in all of these areas. She is the full professor and co-director of the Masters in Museology program at the University of Montréal in Quebec. She is also a professor at École du Louvre, and she is the president of the Committee of Education and Cultural Action of the International Council of Museums. She's written 6 books and numerous articles on adults and how they learn in exhibitions. And she has a Ph.D. in psychology from the University of Montreal and in sociology from the University of Paris. Today, her title of her talk is Let's Revisit Learning, Establishing Better Dialogues Between Adult Visitors and Curators in Exhibition Spaces. So we're grateful to have her here today. Our second speaker, I know that many of you have worked with her in the past, and that's Sue Allen. And Sue Allen is the director of the Department of Visitor Research and Evaluation at the Exploratorium. She is currently acting as the program officer in the Division of Research on Learning in Formal and Informal Settings at the National Science Foundation. Over the last decade, she's been conducting studies on teacher professional development, exhibits, exhibitions, wayfinding, and public programs. Her research focuses on questions that are of interest both to museums and to practitioners and to learning theorists. Her Ph.D. is in science education from the Sesame program at UC Berkeley, and her focus has been on studying the use of model-based reasoning in geometrical optics. Her talk today, the title of her lecture is going to be Video-Based Evidence of Learning as a Process. Now, in the discussions that we have been having about learning, it's often been in an abstract phase of what does a learner look like, talking about learners at different ages. So just to give us a common experience of what learning might look like, I looked around on YouTube to see how families are self-describing themselves and what happened when they're in exhibits. And I chose just one of these. It's about a 3-minute video. And as we look at this video, these are the kinds of questions I was thinking as I thought, so did this family learn something when they came to the museum? Did they learn maybe what we intended them to learn? Was it a good experience? Would I consider this a good learning experience? And how could we have made it better? So it just gives something very concrete to think about, and then as we look at the research, which is more abstract, it gives us a kind of common experience to play it against. So let's look at this 3-minute video. Just one last thing. The Smithsonian had nothing to do with this. I don't know these people. They're just a family from Arizona.
Hi, this is Kat and Kat's Kids, presenting to you our Labor Day at the Smithsonian National Zoo. As the flowers on the boy, you see, you're the best thing that's happened to me, maybe I. Did you know that small mammals can blend into things sometimes?
What is it? What is it?
Fairy dog.
Oh, we have those back in Arizona. Now come on. How cute is that? How cute. It's got like the total Bon Jovi hair going on.
No, my bad. White snake. Oh, with the hair.
Check him out.
And I was a baby one time.
They're super cute, whatever they are. What are they called?
I don't remember, but I saw one of those, but they were babies in magazine. They had a little bit of fur and they're so cute.
Really?
Yeah.
But you don't know what they're called? Let's find out.
Golden lion tamarins.
What are they?
They're golden lion tamarins.
Golden lion tamarins?
No. Tamarins prick each other's hair for lice, then eat it. Mom, I saw a baby one in magazine.
That's strange, children. They're very strange.
Are you learning?
Monkey see, monkey do.
Did you know that mice can fit into very small spaces?
What are we looking for?
The queen is that big fat one over there. Stuck in the tunnel.
I don't think a queen would get stuck in a tunnel. She's got people to help her with that.
No, she ate her peeps. Ate a bunch.
Allie, tell us about ape etiquette.
Ape etiquette is very important. So first, you need to move slowly and quietly. Then, you need to turn around and walk backwards to the glass. And then sit down with your back against glass. And don't look him straight in the eye. And then be patient, because you need to, it takes a while to make new friends. And who wouldn't want to be friends with that guy?
She'll hug him and squeeze him and call him Buddha. Wait, what? You don't see the resemblance? It's uncanny.
Did you know the bum of the macaque is ugly, big, red, ugly, squish bum? That's just wrong. It's big, red, ugly, squish bag. Like sea love. Actually. I like love. Look up in the tree. I like love. Some other show off.
No.
Blah, blah.
But I forgot. My heart is turning to stone. So slow. Can you feel me letting go? I know.
With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Tassé.
Well, I would like first to thank the direction of the education of the Smithsonian Institution for inviting me. I consider this invitation as a real privilege because it affords me with the opportunity to a dialogue with colleagues who are renowned all over the world for their achievement. You probably noticed just by the few words I used that English is not my mother language, and that the English I know, I don't use it very often. Working in Montreal and in Paris it doesn't provide opportunities to practice the English I have. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read my paper. So, over the years, the concept of learning has acquired increasing importance to account for what visitors do when visiting an exhibition.
Increase this just a second.
Oh, sorry. Okay, it's fine. Yes. So, over the years, the concept of learning has acquired increasing importance to account for what visitors do when visiting an exhibition. Nowadays, this importance is such that learning overshadows all other concepts that might facilitate the identification and comprehension of what visitors produce when observing an object, reading a text, or considering what we call in French museography, which I think the equivalent is design, the design of an exhibition. This is regrettable for quite obviously, and this has been noted dozens of times, learning is only represent a part of what the visitor produces. Indeed, unless the concept of learning is deformed to the point of rendering it unrecognizable, it covers only new pieces of knowledge or abilities acquired by a visitor. Theories like constructivism rightly emphasize what precedes learning and what follows it. But even considered this way, learning itself equals the addition of new knowledge or abilities. Whether such a piece of knowledge or abilities are the visitor's first introduction to a field, which is rare in the adult, or add to what he already knows or can do, in no way this changes the narrowness of the concept and its inability to span and describe what a visitor accomplishes during his visit to an exhibition. Thus, A museum that would be concerned only with what is learned would have a very one-sided view of the relationship that the visitor establishes with the exhibition, which, after all, constitutes the museum's main offering. And if the curators of this museum relied solely on this view, they might well run the risk of preparing exhibitions that do not match the visitor's capacities. An alternative concept. I shall focus my exposé on meaning-making, because these days it seems the most interesting alternative to learning. I shall start by defining this concept and then show its relationship with that of learning. Afterwards, I shall examine a method that gives access a visitor's meaning-making process. And lastly, I shall present some data gathered with the help of this method, interpret them, and stress a type of visitor-creator dialogue that takes place in the exhibition room. Then, meaning-making, a definition. When I set out to define meaning-making, I realized that the most helpful studies were those of contemporary philosophers and psychologists, namely Dennert, Gendlin, Merleau-Ponty, Millikan, Ricoeur, Sult, and Taylor. In synthesizing these works, I obtained the following definition. For an individual, the making of meaning consists in symbolizing, i.e., expressing what he is aware of in words. These are the inner words a person keeps to herself, does not pronounce, or eventually speaks out loud. One might also say that meaning-making is the inner discourse that is developed as a person experiences something. It is the inner discourse that follows the experience as it unfolds, or that accompanies that what is thought, imagined, and felt, and that constitute the experience. Thus, in a museum setting, meaning-making may be considered to be the inner discourse that accompanies the visitor's experience as he goes around. Or, if one prefers, it is the inner discourse that corresponds to what a visitor thinks, imagines, or feels. Meaning-making and learning. What I just said implies that meaning-making, in other words, what a visitor thinks, imagines, or feels, is learning only when it represents a new piece of knowledge or ability. The relationship between the two concepts may perhaps be expressed as follows. Learning is based on meaning-making, but meaning-making is not limited to learning. It is much wider and, in fact, corresponds with everything a visitor produces mentally in an exhibition room. The question that comes immediately to mind is how to record meaning-making. So I shall describe a method, but before I shall stress the characteristic that it should possess. A method for recording meaning-making. If the collecting of data on meaning-making is to be valid, it must be done on the spot. Any attempt to do it later, at the end of the visit, for example, generates a description that is biased as regards to what is produced. There are many reasons for this, the most obvious being that what a visitor thinks, imagines, or feels is so abundant and complex that he cannot accurately remember it even a few minutes later. The only method known to date that permits the researcher to gather this on-the-spot data satisfactorily is thinking aloud. This method is now used in many contexts and has been validated in the case of problem solving by Erickson and Simon in 1993. These researchers have shown that thinking aloud does not modify the experience. More precisely, it does not change the orientation, quantity, or quality of the experience. Of course, the thinking aloud method should be adapted to the museum situation. So how was it done? Considering the utilization of thinking aloud in a museum context, the research team that I lead with a colleague of the École du Louvre has adapted the method and established its validity for this context. It consists in asking a visitor as he enters the museum if he would kindly agree to do his visit, saying out loud as he goes along what he thinks, imagines, or feels, without trying to remember or explaining anything, for he will not be questioned on these points. In other words, the method invites him to express spontaneously and without effort whatever comes to his mind. The visitor's words constitute an audible discourse that conveys his inner discourse, his experience. The words are recorded by the researcher assistant who goes around the exhibition with the visitor but never intervenes. The itinerary itself is left entirely up to the visitor. And at the end of the visit, the data on the tape are fed into a computer and subsequently analyzed in their written form. So now let's look at some data collected with this method. Before presenting data, I shall briefly describe the visitors' base from which they are taken. There are three series of data. The first results come from nearly 1,000 visits by adults of the general public type in 3 permanent exhibitions and 7 temporary thematic exhibitions offered in Paris, Montréal, or Quebec. For each visit, we have a discourse and an exhibition exit interview, giving a total of 300 discourses and interviews from permanent exhibition and 700 from temporary exhibitions. A second series comes from the systematic analysis of some 100 permanent and temporary thematic exhibitions on show in major European or North American cities since the last 10 years. And the third series includes about 60 master's theses in museology, museum studies, presented to the École du Louvre or to the University of Montréal. I shall not present groups of tables of graphic. It would be fastidious and of very little use here. I shall rather use a very small selection of data that I shall analyze and from which I shall draw implications. These represent 6 object discourses, in other words, what was said concerning 6 different objects. These object discourses are taken from 300 whole discourses gathered in the 3 permanent exhibitions that I just mentioned. These exhibitions were devoted to objects relating to the fine arts, history, ethnography, archaeology, or natural history. These exhibitions provided a minimum of information, a panel indicating the title of the gallery, and a simple label set nearby to identify each object. Thus, the 6 discourses reveal what visitors of the general public type, what they do when they are more or less left to themselves. Their analysis will enable us to identify the various types of discourse that visitors produce, and in each type, to access the following dimensions of the discourse: the particular way of treating the object, the meaning-making, learning, and sometimes the creativity that accompanies the treatment of the object, the abilities underlying the meaning-making. These data will allow to establish empirically the relationship between meaning-making and learning, but also to understand the dialogue that sometimes takes place between curator and visitor. So let's pass to the analysis. Let us first look at a general result. The 300 discourses produced in permanent exhibition contain 10,260 object discourse, and their analysis revealed three major categories that correspond grossly with the three types of treatment of an object. The 6 discourses that I shall examine illustrate these three types of treatment. The first category, it's very short and simple discourses and treatments of an object, and it represents 35% of the 10,260 object discourse produced in the 3 permanent exhibition. So we have a first discourse. The visitor says, I like that quite a lot. And in parentheses, between parentheses, you have S.2, it's a silence in seconds. Yes, I really like it. A second discourse of the same category. What is that? Here is the label, a Javanese sarong, huh? And that's all. So let us study this discourse. In discourse 1, the visitor is merely moved by the object, whereas in the second, he tries to identify it. The meaning-making process has produced only a few remarks. However, these remarks are not without value, for being moved by an object or trying to identify it constitute a very pertinent activity in a museum situation. It's affective activity in the first case, cognitive in the second. As far as the abilities are concerned, this meaning-making calls on 3 of them: being moved, observing, and reading. Indeed, to be able to say, I like that, one must be capable of being moved. And to be moved, or to want to identify an object, the visitor must have observed it. Lastly, the ability to read here is obvious. Since these are abilities the visitor possesses, one might say that in exercising them, he uses himself. Regarding learning, there is none found in the discourse 1, whereas in discourse 2, there is perhaps an example, the type of object, if it is something new to the visitor. So it grossly corresponds with meaning-making present in the discourse. Since about 50% of the object discourse are similar to discourse 2, and the other 50% are like discourse 1, where new learning could be observed, one can say that in half of the very short object discourse, learning and meaning-making may be almost equivalent. So now let's have a look at the second category. It's discourses and treatment of object of average length and complexity, and it represents nearly 65% of the object discourses. I must say that this category of discourse comes with several variations. I shall present only 3, for all the variations share the characteristic present in the examples that I shall introduce. A first example, the visitor explores his affective reaction to what he is observing. That's a painting I like. I like where it's complicated on the right-hand side. It makes me think of Japanese films where they fight according to rules, and it's like a bit like a ballet. Another example, and this time the visitor explores a cognitive dissonance between what he reads and what he knows. So what's that? Read the label. Marc-Aurèle de Foix, sur leur côté, 1860-1937. Women of Caughnawaga. They weren't women, they looked like nuns. They are wearing veils and long dresses. Squaws didn't have veils or dresses like that. And one last example. Here the visitor vents an emotional reaction, then describes a memory. Gosh, he is huge. And it looks like he is waiting down the roof, the shell, and squashing the man. That reminds me of totems with fantastic animals. I've seen lots of them on the campus of the University of British Columbia. I've even seen one they were setting up, and I saw how the Amerindian was finishing it before the ceremony. The totems on the campus have all sorts of animals: salmons, beaver, whales, bears. They have big teeth, but they are all alone, so they don't look too threatening. They are scary, but really great. You could notice that the visitor evoking his memory doesn't return to the actual object. So what do we learn from these three discourses? First, how the object is treated. The three discourses begin like those in the category 1, namely by affective reaction or by trying to identify it. In fact, 95% of the discourse produced by visitors of the general public type begin in this way, whatever their category. But contrary to what happens in the first category of discourses, the visitor do not stop here. They explore or exploit in some way or another what they have produced in their first contact with the object. As for their meaning-making, this constitutes a set of ideas that arise from one aspect of the object and then links up. Because of this linkage, the ideas may be said to form a small and simple universe of meaning-making. Indeed, a universe formed by a single train of thought. The elements of this universe of meaning stem from two types of sources. The first includes observation, affective reaction to the object, or reading. I mean information coming either from the object or from the label. The second type is from the visitor himself. I mean his personal universe. This is the case when he mentions a Japanese film, knowledge of the clothing habits of American women, or a memory of totems seen on university campus. These latter elements constitute a personal enrichment of the object observed. As the enrichment comes from a free and new match the visitor makes between what he could observe on the object and his personal universe, we could say that the visitor is creative. Well, it's not a very high-rank kind of creativity, but it's kind of creativity. A characteristic of the discourse that appears in category 2 and that was absent in category 1 is that since in this treatment the visitor seeks elements in the object or text and associate them with something of his own, the visitor may be said to establish the beginnings of a dialogue with the offering of the curator. As regards the abilities he uses to produce his universe of meaning, we find the same ones as in the first category of discourse: observing, reading, being moved. But now there are two additional ones. The ability of the visitor to use his imagination. In each discourse, the imagination serves to evoke what I just mentioned, Japanese films and so on. Second, the ability of the visitor to use his data processing system to link up ideas. So the visitor who produces a category 2 discourse may be considered to use himself more than the visitor who produces a category 1 discourses. As far as learning is concerned, only one example is observed. We find this at the beginning of discourse 4. It concerns the name of the sculpture. 4. The other piece of information read, namely the title of the carving, The Woman of Caughnawaga, is rejected as non-pertinent, whereas the information rejected as a strong link with the rest of the discourse, the one accepted seems to have not at all. As a conclusion to this observation, it may be said that learning is not always present in the second category of object treatment, and that when it appears, it is not always closely related to the treatment of the object, and it occupies only a limited place in the totality of the visitor's production. Now, with the third category of discourses, we will notice very important differences in what we have seen up until now. And I would like you to open your folder because the discourse is so long that I could not put it with the reproduction of the object. So the visitor is looking at this painting. Then this category is characterized by lengthy and complex but rare discourses and treatment of the object. It represents less than 1% of the total number of 10,000 discourses. This type of discourse appears with only a few variations that are all well represented in the example I am introducing. So the visitor says, yes, this is a picture that do not please me greatly. I think it's because of all the black, oh hell, I've forgotten the word. But if you look at it alone and closing your eyes, you realize it's interesting. The motifs are very interesting. They have a fine rhythm, a real series of verticals, and quite fine. I'm sure that, and the visitor consulted the label, Tom Thompson was attracted by that. And then, look, the branch in diagonal, which avoids platitude, it's ingenious, as in literature. And then the main three trunks behind continued quite subtly, that's right, the parallels of the, I do not find the word, let's say the front. It's ingenious. In any case, I found it ingenious. And then, yes, are funny the blobs of black, a bit like mistletoe berries. My comparison is not too good because there is any mistletoe here in this country. In any case, they create a sort of net. It could be, oh yes, quite obviously, it could be an abstract painting. I'm still hunting for the word. Well, in the, let's say, the front, are those fir trees or spruce trees that have burned? You see, the visitor is not very clear, confused. I think so. Let's say they are fir trees. If they had not burned, they would have their needles on. Oh, here, that's really cool. The blues of the spruce trees in the distance, they continue the edge of the verticals of the front. And then, oh yes, the pale pink and the pale green in the middle, they are real pleasure for the eyes. And then the salmon pinks, that's terrific. They continue across the black edge of the fir trees. That's really a great idea. Yeah, in fact, you can read this landscape in lots of different ways and watch what's coming. Just what there is in the background, just what is in the foreground. I have found the word I was looking for. And then, yes, for sure, both together. Watch what's going on. Then you can go from one to the other. That's really interesting. It almost looks like tri-dimensional. Oh, look at that. It's not a painting any longer. It's a real landscape. Wait a bit while I look. I like to go and sit in it, and then the visitor go right into the landscape. It seems to be about 11 o'clock in the morning. And then look at the little sun that's all misty. You can feel it's not cold, even if it's late in the fall. Oh yes, you can feel the sun's damp. I would be glad to stay here beside the river, sitting and looking, just taking pictures. I would look at one little corner after the other to take it away with me, to make it last too, multiplying the pictures, multiplying the moments. It's as simple as adding two numbers. It's really great, but I must go. There is others to see. It's so beautiful. It's hard to leave it. Taking a good long look in bits or larger section, it stretches out time. I don't say that because stretching time, and then the visitor becomes confused. It's true, I've stretched out the time. That's really amazing. I've tricked time by making it last longer. I've done it once before, and like it very much. Well, we have to go. I must finish my visit. So what this discourse reveals? Because of its complexity, this discourse could be studied from many different angles. To be brief, I shall limit myself to the aspects treated in the preceding discourses. The visitor starts his treatment of the object by being moved, as we have seen in discourses 1, 3, and 5. The meaning-making resulting from its treatment is lengthy, complex. It differs at least in 3 ways from what we have seen in the second category of discourses. The first difference is the visitor is no longer interested in one single aspect of the object, but in several. He observes them, and then he adds to each something of his own. The second difference, he sees the same thing, for instance, the blobs of black, in a varieties of ways. They are a bunch of mistletoe, then a net, and finally an abstract painting. The third difference is that after adding something to what he is observing, the visitor uses his addition as a starting point to produce something else. He is not content with producing something. He uses what he produced to go further. Thus, his meaning-making is based on abilities already seen and on some that are particular to the third category of object treatment. One might add that this meaning-making constitutes a highly developed and complex dialogue with the object, that it is accompanied by creativity that is much more important than the one seen in the second category of treatment. As regards learning, there is perhaps one, the name of the artist, but as in discourses 4, it is not related to the rest of what the visitor produces, and it represents a very minor part of the visitor meaning-making. Before leaving the analysis of the 6 discourses, I would like to stress how abundant, detailed, and subtle is the information obtained on the treatment of an object by the thinking aloud method. The same quality of information could be obtained on the treatment of the text when, as it is usual in a thematic temporary exhibition, their content is developed. Then, if desired, one can, for instance, relate what was produced after the object and after the label, and understand the sort of help that the label provides or fails to provide. It's possible to relate it in a very detailed and precise way. Now let's have a series of data and the interpretation. Let's consider the empirical relationship between learning and meaning making. When members of the general public visit a permanent exhibition of fine arts, history, ethnology, archaeology, or natural history, where the texts are minimal and visitors more or less on their own, we observe the following. The place occupied by learning in the treatment of an object is reduced, except in the case of very short treatments, where it may coincide with the meaning-making as a whole. Moreover, in this case, as in more complex treatments, learning is not always present. Finally, when it is not necessarily closely linked with the rest of the visitor's meaning-making. The data studied does not only confirm but also detail and explain the theoretical position that I took at the beginning of my paper. Consequently, they clearly show that learning constitutes a partial and biased indicator of what a visitor of the general public type produces in a permanent exhibition of a certain type of objects. The data also confirm that meaning-making is a far better indication of this production. To me, meaning-making, as we have seen, corresponds more or less with what in French we call connaissance. And if I want to translate in English, I would say knowledge, but not a piece of knowledge. It would be knowledge in general. And if we want to consider the concept of education, I would give this meaning to education, I would say it's the development of the adult. So during our discussion, we could raise the question of what is the contribution of object treatment like category 2 or category 3 in the development of the visitor. At the beginning of my expose, and while analyzing the discourses, I point out to the dialogue that the visitor established with the object, I mean, with the curator's offering. Now I would like to turn to this dialogue and have a closer look to it in order to better understand it, and of course to identify means to enhance it. But I shall first look at the characteristic of the dialogue. So the characteristic of the dialogue. The dialogue that was observed in the discourses 2 and 3 seems to be almost totally concerned with the object, and very seldom with the text of the label, and never with the gallery wall panels. This disproportion between these elements may be explained very simply by the very limited nature of the labels and wall panels of the exhibition the visitor were visiting. As revealed in the discourses, the dialogue consists essentially in grasping one aspect of the object observed and in grafting onto it something that comes from the visitor, more particularly from his personal universe, but which, as we saw in discourses 6, could be very complex. Although simple, this dialogue or game, as we might call it, because as this dialogue is carried very freely and without effort by the visitor, this dialogue may be considered from several angles, of which the following aspects are, to me, some most interesting. First, it requires creativity on the visitor's part to establish a link between what he sees and an element of his personal universe, and then to treat this pertinently. Two abilities account for those two aspects of creativity, namely, the first is utilizing one imagination in both its reproductive and constructive forms as identified by Immanuel Kant. As in the second category of discourses, the visitor's reproductive imagination serves to recall some piece of knowledge or of past experience and to associate this with an object. As regards his constructive imagination, this participates in various operations like that of transforming what he sees. For instance, in Discourse 6, the dark lines crisscrossing in the foreground become a bunch of mistletoe or an abstract painting. And later, the entire painting is transformed in a real landscape in which the visitor enters and spends a few moments. The second ability is using the data processing system that an adult possesses for articulating the idea produced with the help of imagination and giving these ideas both coherence and direction. It is easy to understand that without this articulation, the universe of meaning produced by the visitor would be completely chaotic. Another characteristic of the dialogue is that it entails a real enrichment of the object, for what the visitor says is rarely false. In fact, we analyzed the 10,000 and so discourses, and we found about 3% of what the visitor says that could be false. Besides, it represents a psychological appropriation of the object, at least as regards some of its aspects. And as any educator or psychologist knows, this is very important for the productive reutilization of what the visitor has produced and for its development. Lastly, the dialogue is synonymous with what we call interaction and with what museums try to obtain by a variety of means. Now I'm going to leave aside the dialogue for a moment that takes place in the permanent exhibition to consider what occurs in the temporary thematic exhibition, because the situation is very different. Regarding the dialogue in the temporary thematic exhibition, my team observed that when the texts of this type of exhibition are detailed, the dialogue is very often established with them. One may therefore conclude that what the visitor takes as a basis of dialogue depends mainly on the way the exhibition is designed. In fact, in some of the 7 temporary thematic exhibitions we collected data, we observed that the treatments of the text, sometimes the label, sometimes the section panels, the panels that are attached to every part of an exhibition. This section panel entails very complex discourses. The visitors really dialogue with the text more or less as they dialogue with an object in the permanent exhibition studied. We also noticed that the reading behavior of the visitor is closely related to the text, and especially with the relationship they have with what could be observed on the objects. Enhancing the dialogue. There are 2 ways of enhancing the dialogue. One, the first is to increase the visitor's skills in treating the objects, which may be obtained by offering them a short program. In fact, my research team designed and experimented such a program and obtained satisfactory results. The second way is to modify permanent exhibition so as to promote the production of a higher rate of category 2 and 3 discourses. Finally, I should say that the analysis of these discourses offer a series of data that can guide educators in the development of their programs and curators in the design of their exhibitions. And now, some propositions to conclude. The data presented here and their significance imply, first of all, that the notion of learning should be replaced by that of meaning-making, but I underline when one wants to account for what adult visitors produce in an exhibition. However, and I would underline however, this replacement does not mean total abandonment, for, as we have seen, learning can be identified in the means of meaning-making. And using both concepts can provide insight in their relationship. Secondly, a comparison between meaning-making in permanent and in temporary thematic exhibitions highlights the effect of different exhibition design and their impact of visitors, and it's possible to detail it in a very, very subtle way, and usually to make a relationship, a close relationship with, for instance, the content of a text and the way it's treated by a visitor, or an aspect of the design of an exhibition and the way the visitor treated. In fact, the characteristics of an exhibition have profound effects on the visitor, so they should be introduced beside the characteristic of the visitors as strong, I would say very strong variables in what is called now visitor studies. Actually, unfortunately, these studies rarely include these characteristics of the exhibition. There are some, but it's rare. Thirdly, the information provided by the Thinking Aloud method could guide the curator in the development of completely new type of exhibitions. I mean that I think that the curator should not feel or should not be trapped with the actual type of exhibition that we know, either the permanent exhibition with its variations or the thematic exhibition. There are lots of other possibilities. And I think that with the Thinking Aloud and the discourse we could obtain, it would be easy to monitor the reaction of the visitors and how they treat such new types of exhibitions, and to adjust these types. Because with the permanent exhibition, we have a very long tradition of using it. With the thematic ones, it's shorter, it's about 40 years, 50 years. So we feel that it's a type that we don't master to the same extent as the permanent exhibition. But I insist on the possibility of developing and creating new types of exhibition and monitoring their possibilities and the way the visitor treat them and how to improve them and stabilize them as we stabilize the permanent exhibition. So I thank you.
Thank you very much, Colette. That was fascinating. I know we're going to hold questions until the end, but I do just want to invite everyone to stand up and shake a leg and get the blood flowing, because I know it's a long time to sit, and we have to do a little bit of juggling of our audio-visual anyway. So, and I also invite those of you in the back to maybe come forward, because I think you may find it easier to hear and see some of the things I'm going to show if you're not way in the back. So there's the invitation. Shall I? Shall I move it over? Fascinating colour scheme, isn't it? I'm sure you've got some magic you can do.
So, oh, there you go. Second. Okay.
It's so wonderful to have a magician. Thank you, Larry. Okay, so let's start. So yes, so I'm Sue Allen, and I just want to say again, and first of all, thank you, Pino, and for inviting us, and thank you, Stephanie, and all the wonderful kind hosts we've had today. It's been a joyful day getting to know some of the wonderful Smithsonian staff here. Just to say which hat I'm wearing today. Part of working at the National Science Foundation, as I now do, is that I need to be very careful about which hat I'm wearing. And actually I do even have a hat, so today I'm here representing the work that I do at the Exploratorium. I'm temporarily on leave at the National Science Foundation. Okay. So I'm going to make this quite an interactive talk. I really want to get some discussion going and hear what you guys have to say about some of the videos that I'd like to show. But I'm going to make a few comments at the beginning and at the end, and then most of the time given to watching videos and talking about them together. This word learning is just so laden, and I think Colette really hit some of the wonderful nuances and issues around it. I'm going to take a slightly different tack, actually, as you'll see. But I think at the deepest level, we have some similarities in how we look at this. I talk to people about learning and say, when people say, how many of you have actually spoken to someone who says, well, I know they're having a great time at your museum, but what are they learning? Show of hands, how many people have had that question addressed to you? Yeah, about half of the people. I get that a lot too. So one of the things I ask people when they say that is, well, what do you mean by learning? What would it look like for you? And I think for a lot of us, even the people working in museums, the kinds of things people think of when you say, what does learning look like, are these things, little kids running into a schoolroom and school buses, and maybe some professorial type with a pointer lecturing from a blackboard, that kind of a thing. And of course, books, lots of books. And maybe the books have some kind of a process where the knowledge, I like that one particularly, the knowledge sort of pours into the head from the book. And some suggestion of symbols, numbers maybe, and a clock to remind you that it's all very stressful and there's probably time limits and probably a test. So, these are the kinds of images of learning that we have, I think, in our culture. And you may ask, well, does it really matter if that's what people think when you say learning? And I really think it does. And I think some of the reasons that it really matters is that if you have those quintessential images of learning, then you tend to devalue the kinds of things that are happening in informal settings, like museums and like everyday settings, and like all the ways that people have been learning in cultures across the world, across thousands of years. And so I just think it's really important for us to be aware of what's driving our constructs. I think it can also limit our citizens, because if we think that learning has to be of school-age children in formal settings, in schools with people lecturing at us, and it has to have, outcome measures that look like multiple choice standardized tests and so on, I think those images also constrain the kinds of educational experiences that we as citizens are looking at, and what we value and where we put our funding and all the rest of it. So I guess for me, the actual definition of learning is not simply an academic act, it's a very political act, especially in this day and age where accountability is affecting us all so much. So that's sort of the one thing that I wanted to say, was that for me it's a very political act. By contrast with Colette's sort of response to this, which is to, I have my little thing, flip hat, okay, hat, right. So let me tell you about the hat. This is my hat. What I'm putting this hat, I'm going to put the hat on and off, and the hat is to remind me that the tape I'm about to show you is actually a research video. It's not available for general dissemination. So I have consent from the participants to show it at a professional meeting like this. I do not have consent to broadcast it on the web. So from the legal aspects, I am compelled to say that and to ask our kind video recorder and webcaster at the back there, Mark, to stop the video so that you can enjoy the video, but that we're not distributing more broadly. So please remind me, you're welcome to talk about that too, in terms of, did you see any learning at all going on in that clip? Can I read the chart? Yes. So strand 1 is excitement, interest, motivation to learn. Strand 2 is using the canon of science, or the facts, the concepts, sort of using scientific knowledge. 3 is about doing the inquiry, the process side of science, observing, trying, asking questions. 4 is reflecting on the nature of science and your own learning of science. 5 is participating in science with others in a community. And 6 is developing an identity over time. Yes?
So, you guys hear me?
Yes.
So what I thought was interesting was a teacher would have said, good, you figured out that it was a temporary magnet, A+. But that was right when the girl figured that out, that was right when the guy was like, okay, now this is boring, and I want to keep playing with these and keep doing inquiry. So she got a little formal, and then she solved it like she was done. and like walked away a little bit. So I thought it was really interesting how he was doing like almost all the strands, but she did a very formal strand and then was done. So I think adults have a hard time with that kind of thing.
Thank you. There's a couple of people here. Yeah.
I'd like to observe that there was a very high degree of experimentation going on there. And the ability to experiment automatically generates, at least in my mind, automatically generates an ability to learn. When you experiment, you try and observe, and that bears out one of your significant screens.
Thank you. So a lot of strand 3, I guess that's one there to point to. Yes, thanks.
Well, to me, it seems that the young lady doesn't find her way with this, the characteristic of the material she has. But the young man, after a moment of browsing with the material, seems to find one direction. He explores it, and he discovers something very important, that magnetism could help provide him with the opportunity of building a bridge. And he could even experiment the resistance of this bridge. So to me, there is great learning.
Yes.
And it's wonderful because we could follow the steps that he's using.
Yes, it sounds like what you were saying too, that there's almost all 6 of the strands there that he was doing. And that he does generate some sort of canonical ideas, I think, about bridge building.
I'd just like to say that I thought that she was learning through tactile. She was learning what magnetism felt like when she was pulling and pulling and pulling at those magnets over and over again. So I think that she had more than one strand rather than just the formal.
Yeah, that's a great point.
But I agree that he did have many of those strands.
Do you see her that tactile aspect that I agree is so key? Do you see that anywhere here, or do you think we're missing that in this framework? Is it 3? The idea of experimenting often has that interactivity in it, yeah?
Well, the tactile would really reinforce what you were describing, you know, as a way of learning.
Other thoughts? Yes, go ahead.
I felt like she actually went through more of the strands than he did. I felt like her initial motivation was to come at this in a problem-solving way, and she went through several of the steps. And I agree with the first speaker that she went through it very quickly, but then she seemed to have solved the problem and she left. Whereas he came in it more with the motivation to almost treat it like a toy, and he recognized the absence of any kind of formal rules and started to just play with them almost in a free-thinking kind of way, and building bridges and things like that.
Thank you.
I noticed when the gentleman said, is there directions with this thing? He was kind of searching for what he should be doing or learning, but I think because there were not directions, he was freed up to do more of, I guess, number 3, where he's just trying different things and trying to figure it out. So it probably would be better that it wasn't a very directed exercise. It really left it more open for him to discover on his own.
And then building on that, further application. So it's not just the one task, you do it, I've learned the lesson, I'm done, which she somewhat did, of realizing, okay, they're magnetic when they're connected, they're not magnetic when I just have the washers in my hand. But he then took that and applied it into engineering feats of the bridge and suspension and repercussions of building bridges out of magnetic washers. And so it's taking that one concept where if you have those rules of this is what this activity is, this is what you do, but instead allow them that freedom to explore their own ideas and their own motivations and see other applications to what they're experiencing.
Mm-hmm. And what attention is that in our field, in exhibit development, of when to, how much to say and how much to let go? Because I think there's a lot of trade-offs in that design space.
And the gentleman made his own meaning because of the specific place he lives, the Bay Area, where they're rebuilding the Bay Bridge right now to make it, quote unquote,
earthquake-proof. So that part of the dialogue may not have happened in a science center on the East Coast.
Yeah, great point, the personalization. Okay, I'd like to now introduce another framework. I don't know if this is too much, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so what I'd like to do is a little bit of an introduction, and then I'd like us to talk about this same video again, but from a different lens, and see if you guys have any more thoughts about it. Let's see. We are. Okay. So I want to just talk briefly about a sociocultural lens on learning. And I'm actually not a socioculturalist. I was not trained in that tradition, but I'm going to take a shot at looking at it with you from that lens, because I think it's becoming a very important paradigm in our field. A lot of people are talking about sociocultural views of learning. That's really one of the dominant views of learning in this century. And also particularly because it focuses on social learning, and that's such a dominant way that our museums work. So I just want to take a few points from sociocultural theory and see if we can use them as a lens to look at that same video. So a few of the things, and please correct me, those of you who are sociocultural theorists. I know that Smithsonian has fantastic expertise in a lot of areas, so I probably have several of them here in the audience, and I invite you to add your own thoughts to this. The main thing, and a lot of this comes from Vygotsky, who was a Russian psychologist, who was sort of responding to the whole Piagetian idea of maturation and learning is happening in a person's head. And he took this perspective of saying, well, but learning is also cultural and social. It happens outside the head. It happens in social settings. And in fact, his main claim was that it happens first in social settings and later it gets in someone's head. And so the idea, I think Colette gave a great example with these internal discourses. I think Vygotsky would say that the reason that people are able to do these think aloud protocols is that they have been in conversations with people growing up, whereby those sorts of conversations then become internalized in their own heads. And so that's sort of one of the things to look for, is social first and then internalized. Another thing is the meaning-making process. And again, Colette spoke very eloquently about what that looks like. One of the things to look for as you look in a tape is learners using familiar objects and particularly familiar activities, things that they're used to doing, to interpret the new. So you may want to think about whether you saw any of that going on in the tape. And then the last point I want to just pull out of sociocultural is the idea of scaffolding, which is such a central idea in our field, and again, something that I think we see a lot of in our museums. And the idea, just a couple of things there, that what you'll see is people guiding or structuring activity to make it easier for people who don't have the skills. And it's often adults scaffolding for children. So they will take a complex activity like doing a jigsaw puzzle and sort of lay out the steps for the child so the child can do the easier parts. And one of the great phrases you can use at cocktail conversations about this is ZPD, which is Zone of Proximal Development. How many people have heard that term? Oh, good. Okay, so the idea there being that a child or a learner has expertise. There's things they can already do. There's things they can't do. And then in between, there's this zone where there are things they can do with help. And that's where the learning happens, because according to Vygotsky, you learn by internalizing from a social activity. So that's where our museum really works well, is by having a place where parents and children can be in that zone of proximal development. And the last thing just to look at is the use of tools, and especially symbolic tools like language. So appropriating, snagging words and ideas from each other. So are there places when you look at the tape where you saw one or other of the people sort of in the conversation, in the activity, snagging words or ideas and kind of negotiating their meaning, trying them out, starting to internalize them for themselves? So I want to just, actually, no, I'll leave that up, because then, sorry, it's not really quite focused, is it? But can you see that? Actually, maybe it's my eyes, that's what it is. Well, good enough. So with that as a framework, very much looking at the social aspects and the guiding, structuring aspects, thinking back on that piece of videotape, do people feel like there was anything going on there that they saw with this as a framework for learning. Yeah, go ahead.
I think so. They were both expressing their own thoughts. There wasn't really a conversation that was going on. And so it was more individual. I wouldn't call it a proper social setting. At least that's what I thought. And actually this, if we're talking about social settings, science makes it easier, but it's much harder in the arts and the humanities fields as we go. If individuals feel inhibited, and that's where language perhaps comes in. So in there, I really didn't see an exchange or a communication between the two.
So pretty much solo activity, not really getting a lot of cross-pollination going on that you saw. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Well, I was thinking that even though maybe it was an obvious exchange, that they were still speaking out loud, you know, and they were speaking and sharing the things with each other, even if on the surface they weren't responding to each other in that way. So I thought that that was very indicative of social exchange.
I saw her seeming to really approach this in terms of trying to solve a problem. And when she took them out of the bowl and demagnetized them, she was trying to show him what she had discovered. And then that's at the point where she got up and left, and he was speaking, I don't know if she was within the proximity, but he was definitely speaking aloud. And I don't know if he was just speaking his mind and, you know, talking about the bridge development. But it seemed like he was trying to show her what he was actually discovering with the building of the bridge, and you know, he was definitely relating the understanding that he had back to her. Kind of whether or not she was putting that in her framework was not in the video, but he was definitely trying to tell her what he had discovered.
Other thoughts? One thing I noticed, and if we had, oh yes, go ahead.
I thought most of the things were going on, but with the exception of the scaffolding, because it wasn't as though one was the teacher and one was the student. They were both learning together, but I think what Manjula said, it was more parallel in how they were sorting through it. But he was using symbolic language like bridges to describe it as he was making conceptual connections. And that at first he started using these washers like blocks, trying to stack up a tower. And then that really wasn't very satisfactory. So he started with what he would usually do, and then he went to something else.
One piece that, oh, did someone else? I'll fill in while you're thinking of the next thing you'd like to say. But just one thing that I noticed about the third time through this tape was that, and I don't want to go back and play it again because I'd like to show you another tape, and I'm cognizant of time, but is that moment where she's teaching him about, or she talks about the temporary magnet, and there is actually an exchange. In fact, I can tell you what they say. She says, "These are temporary magnets." He says, "What do you mean, temporary magnets?" She says, "These are washers, just regular washers, David." He says, "Yeah, it's this that's charged," referring to the permanent magnet. "These don't stick." "These don't either." "Oh, yes, they do." "Yeah," she says, "they become temporary magnets." So that exchange went by rather fast, and I know it's a bit difficult to hear the audio, but I thought that, for me, that seemed like a possible example of where there was some appropriation of words and ideas, because there's this idea of temporary magnet that she's getting across, and he's kind of like, no, what the heck? And then it's sort of like, well, maybe, what is a temporary magnet? And oh yes, we have an experiment to do that. And so I think by the end she reinforces and says, yes, they're temporary magnets. So I don't know, that was, for me, that was the one example that I thought I saw in that tape. Okay, you want to see another tape?
Just a second.
Oh, sure, yes, please.
It seemed to me that they were tuning in and out of one another in the social setting. It seemed to me that at the beginning they were both shoveling and clearing the bar and starting to work on the gap. I think that they both noticed, maybe they felt a sense of redundancy, so that they wanted to sort of break apart a little bit and do something individually kind of interesting. Not germane to that, but I noticed he was particularly conscious of the camera But then he mentions something about a chair, need for it, and she goes away and gets one, comes back. So I think in terms of the socio thing, the sort of tuning in and out, it was only after thinking about it more that I figured that they're actually working more closely together than I was thinking during the film itself, when it seemed that after the beginning, when they finished shoveling and clearing that gap, getting the things off, it seemed like then they went off and did their own thing. But then I remembered, well, she came back with a chair.
She came back with a chair. So thanks for raising that. That brings me to one question I wanted to ask before we leave this, which was to come back to the design question. Can you think, since it sounds like you guys are characterizing this as a lot of some of these strands happening here, but not so much, oh, there's mine. That's my sort of cliff notes for the sociocultural. Oh, you can't read it anyway because there's no light. Okay. But I did just want to say, were there things about the design that you felt, of thinking about that exhibit, something that either supported any of these forms of learning or inhibited it? Things where you felt like, oh, you know what they should have done with that exhibit? Or, wow, you know what really helped support that kind of learning was... So, yeah, go ahead.
One of the things I noticed that just encourages the social setting is having multiple chairs, that they were both able to sit down together on opposite sides of it and explore that together, showing that it's not an individual activity. And there was certainly, it was large enough that more people could have stood around it if you had a family. There certainly could have been, you know, kids as well as adults all working on it at the same time.
Yeah.
I actually just had a question. Was the museum's objective that visitors understand a temporary magnet versus a permanent magnet, or is there something the museum is hoping for that they didn't get?
Great question, and we have lots of arguments about that very issue. The particular developers, you know, the Exploratorium, it tends to focus on strand 3, I would say, of these strands, and is less concerned about strand 2. So that's what I would say in general. Part of that is reflected in the lack of a label. There is no label for that exhibit. So, yes, someone here wanted to say something, yeah. Oh, all right. Any other thoughts about either strengths or weaknesses of design? Yeah.
Well, I agree with the chair, but I noticed that she quickly got up and left. And he seemed to really be having fun using these magnets in different ways. And he actually left his chair as well, but it was so that he could approach the challenge from a different angle. And you know, that's when he left his chair and was playing with the bridge itself. I did notice a large sticker or something on the inside of that magnetic bowl. I don't know what that was. I couldn't read it, but was that an interpretive label, or was that notifying them of a camel?
That's a great segue. That's actually an artifact of the recording, and I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes, so thanks for raising that. Yeah, go ahead.
I thought the use of the washers was helpful because it's a familiar object, so that they knew going in that they weren't automatically magnetic.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I wondered about, because it looked like about 4 people could sit comfortably at that, so I wondered a little bit about what the optimal number of people communicating is. And then I wondered if there are ways that people could share their discoveries with the next visitor or challenges. Not that the museum is determining what it is, but that people could be posting and putting up their own challenges to each other.
Nice idea. Okay, I want to go on and just, actually, how are we doing for time? It's so fun looking at video. Do I have a chance for one more video? Yes. Yes? Okay. I just want to show you this one because this is an adult child video and it has a lovely quality. Okay, this is an exhibit called Heat Camera. How many of you know this? Oh, hats. Thank you. Fabulous. Okay. How many people know an exhibit like this, have seen an exhibit like this, recognize it immediately? Okay, a few. Basically, it's a camera that's designed to sense the radiation coming from an object and determine its temperature based on that. So what you do is you sit down like she's doing there, and when you look at an image of yourself, you see it in color, which reflects the dark blue areas are the places that are cool, and the orange and red are the hottest parts of you. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a video of a use of this exhibit by a young boy called Max. You'll hear his mother calling him Max. And just to say, they are the two people. Everyone else you see is a stranger to them when they arrive. How's the volume, by the way? Can you all hear from the... His sticker on his sweater, his entry sticker. Okay, this is actually a 7-minute clip, so I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but I think you get a sense of it. And actually at the end of this, Max goes off and takes his sweater and ties it onto a different exhibit, and they come back and do an experiment with it too. So it's actually a wonderful clip to look at all together. Thank you. Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so let's talk again about learning. Did you see any learning here? Pick your framework, pick your strand.
Actually, one of the things that I really loved about this one was it was very much the social setting, since the little boy was very interested in, oh, there's another person over there, I want to go back there, and sit down. And as soon as the two gentlemen left, he started to quickly lose interest, and his mom had to show him something else. And then the teenager's there, it's, oh, I want to come back and learn something else. And then he starts copying the teenager. So I thought that was a very good example of the social setting as an impetus for learning.
Thank you.
Well, certainly he was excited. There's a lot of excitement in that video. And he was trying to also, I think there was some of both. I think more with the 6 strands, really, I saw in this video. But again, you know, him touching and rubbing the hands, that visceral kind of learning, which is not really on that list there. But I think they did go through he was going through, even at that young age, kind of reflecting and, you know, trying it again and moving the button around or whatever it was that he had. And it was quite a joy to watch him.
I think it's surprising in this one even more than with the adult learners. He is really using scientific process to explore the activity. He really, first his button really interested him. Why was it a different color? And then he actually, I think someone said he went away to a different exhibit and got bored, but I actually think my observation was that he went to touch something warm and he came back and he said, now my hands are orange. So he was really actually interpreting this and using it to observe and experiment with the activity. So,
thank you. I can take one or two more and then I need to move on.
It's certainly the strand 3. He's having a lot of fun. He's totally uninhibited, so he's trying lots of things. But in terms of really scientific learning, how do we know in the whole process what level the different people who come have learned?
So you're asking a strand 2 question, is that what you're asking? Has he gotten some of the sort of canonical facts and concepts of science? Is that what you're asking? Or?
Yes, and since there are 3 or 4 people who come in and out, at what different levels? What are they taking away? And at what level?
Great question. Did anyone see any evidence that someone's taking away anything about canonical science? Would you say there was no science going on there, or would you think there was?
Well, I don't have a comment about that, but I did see some scaffolding going on, and we can certainly see it in this still photograph, which no one who is not in this auditorium can see, but where the little boy was watching what the teenager was doing, and even you could see with his peripheral vision that there would be, you know, the one, and between the two of them, one would kind of hold his foot up, and then the other one would hold his foot up, and he was really progressing from kind of the obvious, my hands, my shirt, and then we got, you know, my tongue or my ear or, you know, that sort of thing. So there was a lot of scaffolding going on that I saw.
Right. I think I want to make okay, last comment and then I'll do a little wind up. Thank you.
Well, I think the scaffolding question can be used to answer that first one too. I saw interesting amounts of scaffolding taking place because the scaffolding between the teenager and the young boy did not seem to be anything spoken. They were responding more visually to the cues that each other were giving and doing so to, you know, experiment with the reaction that they were getting on the screen. But when the mother first sat down with the boy, it seemed like she was taking a little bit more direction in trying to get him to compare the colors with different warm parts of his body. The shirt was wet, and that's why it was cold. But she wasn't going much into the actual science behind it. But what I noticed with her is that she was watching the boy touch, and when he was spinning around and he was looking for the sticker, she was glancing between the boy and the screen, going back and forth and back and forth. So she was, it seemed like she was really experimenting with the reactions that he was getting. So.
Yes, good comment. I guess one I can't resist just chiming into on the excellent question about what's the evidence that you have for some of these things, and in particular the science learning. I guess I would say that this question of what does yellow mean is actually quite a legitimate science question, because I think here what you're seeing is, or at least this is my interpretation, I'm just speaking for me, but I think these sorts of representations that are so much used in science, these sorts of multicolored displays and graphs and charts and representations are such a fundamental part of science that to be saying what does it mean to have this aspect of a representation, and that she connects it then with the wetness of his shirt is wet and that's why it's dark, why it's blue. I would argue that there's a lot of really good science reasoning in there, or maybe proto-reasoning, but I think there's a good potential for science there. Okay, so now I have 5 minutes, which is a perfect amount just to wind up. So I guess I want to just make one more sort of political pitch, and that is to say that recording like this can be very powerful. And this is actually a very nice compliment, I think, to Colette's point about think aloud protocols as a very useful method for getting inside someone's inner discourse. Another method for getting at the external discourse is exactly this videotaping. And I encourage anyone to really consider this as a very powerful tool. Recording, it doesn't have to be video, you can do audio too, but we do a lot of video recording at the Exploratorium, and I think it's transformed a lot of the ways that our staff do some of their exhibit development. Oh my goodness, wow, I never put that animation in, but it's kind of nice. Okay. I think, first of all, that it's well suited to these definitions we've been talking about that are processes, learning as a process. When you can document the learning process, then you can again talk about evidence, and that helps you talk to stakeholders, showing them the evidence of learning in a process way. So I think it's very good for that. I think it's great for getting you close to the learning that's happening in the trenches. You really feel like you're at the museum and really seeing learning happening. It's a really good prototyping tool. Colette mentioned the power of this too, that you can now reflect on, if you're the exhibit developer, how is it going? What kinds of conversations are people having? And it's been a very powerful professional development tool at the Exploratorium, because you have all these people that can sit in a room just like we are and look at the same video and talk about it. What are we seeing? What is learning looking like? It's really been a very powerful tool for our staff. And lastly, you can use it over and over by asking new questions that come up and go back and look at the video and do systematic and research types of studies if you want to do that. Oh, this is interesting. Ah, okay. And then just to say that, of course, it has downsides. The biggest challenges, I would say, are the technical ones. Principally, the audio is very difficult to get good quality audio, especially in a loud environment. The ethical issues, and that goes back to your question about, I'll show you in a moment, how we solve the issue. Ethical issues, people need to understand that they're being videotaped, and you heard of them talking about it in these tapes. And lastly, that the coding of the video is very time-taking. So it's not to say these are easy methods, but I think they really are worth considering as we go forward, thinking about how to document learning in the future. This is just a couple of pictures of how we do it at the Exploratorium. Joshua Gutwell, my colleague at the Exploratorium, has done, and his team have done some wonderful work with thinking about how to get people informed that they are being videotaped. And this is rather a dark shot, so here's the picture. The diagram that shows somebody sitting at a table. You can see the microphones that capture their sound. We have a special system actually for getting good quality audio. We have a camera in the top corner, and then we have stanchions so that people know that in that area they have to walk by the big posted signs that tell them they're being videoed. And then in addition to that, we also have that red sticker. You can see it again, that little red star thing in the middle of the table there, which says, "You are being videotaped now," so that people really do know where their attention is focused, that's what's happening. So I'll just end by saying that all the photos and videos that you saw or didn't see, my apologies to those online, were courtesy of the Exploratorium, and I just want to name some of the great people that I have the privilege of working with, and also thanks to the Going 8 project team that provided these videos. So thanks all for participating. I appreciate it. I'll just close that.
And now we have a few minutes for some general questions, maybe about the relationships between the two presentations, and also for those of you that had questions from Colette's presentation earlier, or additional follow-up questions.
It seems that a common thread between both of the presentations was this concept of taking new ideas and using your current understandings as a framework to engage these new kind of ideas. My question was, did you happen to interview anybody that did these kinds of activities more than one time? Did anybody go to that abstract painting and approach that a second time, you know, the next day or a week later? And what would have been the reaction of that man and that woman when they approached the magnet table if they would have come back a couple hours later? Or do you think that their reactions would have been different?
Would you like to? To be honest, I would have a very quick answer. I have no idea, because I've never had the opportunity of doing that. Well, I could just talk starting from the experience I could have, or the experience that other people like me could have. And I don't think it's very valuable, because we are so different from the general public. But to me, I think that when you have a visitor like the Discourse 6, who has produced this sort of very complex object treatment, we already know that she already had tried to do it, but she's repeating that. So it means that once a visitor has succeeded to do something, I would say, extraordinary, he tends to repeat it because of the enjoyment, of the pleasure that accompanies such success, because you have a very profound pleasure. It's the pleasure of competence that comes with doing such an accomplishment. And you also have the pleasure, the intellectual pleasure and the aesthetic pleasure. I mean, once it's art object, I feel, but I always underline what the precaution I'm using. I feel that the variety of pleasures that a visitor enjoys doing what the visitor in Discourse 6 was doing is enough to help a visitor to start again trying to do that and eventually try something else. In fact, I tried with a bunch of students of the Master in Museology in Paris and in Montreal to interview visitors, I mean repeat visitors, to have an idea on how they become repeat visitors and what they gain from that. But unfortunately, as it was done by master level students, the information we have is rather general, so I could not help use it to answer your question. I'm very sorry, maybe in 2 or 3 years' time I could have some good information, but not now.
One of the things I was struck by in the science exhibits was that there didn't seem to me, maybe because it's the length of time, a huge zone of proximal development for either activity. They're almost, and I think this is a pretty common thing to find in museums, especially those that have a high volume of visitation, is that a lot of exhibits tend to be very quick hits. And that can be, it can be similar in an art museum too, where people are not engaging in something that's going to be a lengthy developmental process. And that's actually kind of a criticism of informal learning settings, is that there isn't this sort of inherent level of challenge like Csikszentmihalyi talks about, where you're looking for a challenge or a problem to solve or overcome in order to get to the next level. So in looking at the science, it just seems like they kind of got pretty quickly what they needed to get, that it becomes magnetized, or that body temperature shows up in different colors for a couple of different reasons. Whereas in looking at the very lengthy discourse of the art object, you have a more challenging object, and they're going very, very deeply into, they're just going a lot further in what they're getting out of it. So my question then is, as people who are looking at and designing exhibits, what is it that we want to take from both of these examples about how to get to that level of challenge that's going to help people make the next connection?
That's a great question. I'd love to hear other people's responses to that. Do you feel like there's something intrinsic there, that the science exhibits are just, we're up against too much of a challenge, or is there a solution to that? Or did you agree that that seemed like a non-flow experience? Or other comments about that?
I'm not sure if I'm completely understanding the question, but kind of what I come away with is that it's two very different process of, looking at art, you're having them speak aloud of what they're processing, whereas in the videos, they're not required to say everything that they're thinking through and how they're applying it, and so that may still be apparent in, what on the surface looks like a very quick experiment and concept and, process that they're going through. But I think maybe if you layered, then you could get to some of the more complex ideas that are coming about in how they're thinking about that. So I'm not sure you could compare, what one study is getting from speaking aloud, looking at a painting, versus just videotaping a surface approach of what is going on at a science museum.
We're also looking at experience with one object. I'm really interested to see what happens when they go from one to another. Is there a way to build from one to another, whether it's an abstract work of art? Does that help them, or does that influence the way that they see the next landscape? So for me, I think that's something that would be a next step.
And over time.
Over here.
I was also thinking, Colette mentioned that discourse number 6 is basically 1% of your interview. Think Loud. I was thinking if you do have other videos showing something which is more complex, such as number 6.
You're asking if I have something comparable?
Yeah.
Well, I would make the claim, maybe I'll just show my cards here, I would make the claim that Max video, which we only saw a third of or a half of, is exactly that, because I think it's a very extended, to me, very impressive set of repeat investigations and explorations and learning, entirely driven by the curiosity and intrinsic motivation of this boy and the people around him. And I would also say, point well taken about the methodology, that we are seeing a certain cut of it for that reason, but it's a 7-minute video, and that's a very unusual length of time for a science exhibit. And I will just also say that this particular project, the Going Ape project, I didn't have time to talk about it, but it had the project that we did at the Exploratorium, and it wasn't, I don't want to take credit for it. You just see me here and you think I did it, but it was actually a wonderful team of people who worked to make sure, to try to extend the holding time and the investigation of exhibits. So these exhibits were particularly designed to try to get away from that 1-minute phenomenon that you absolutely are right in identifying. And what they found was that, and there's a book actually that you can get online, it's a wonderful book, I recommend it, which talks about the 4 kinds of exhibits they created that that changed the exhibit experience in several ways. It got people asking more questions, and the kinds of questions they asked were different. They were more about how an exhibit works and what's going on rather than what do you do next kinds of questions. And the way they answered them shifted from looking at the label to actually investigating with the exhibit for themselves. So there were a number of changes that they had, this gradual shift. So I think these exhibits, and they're interesting for that reason, I think really do create what I would consider a very extended best case kind of science museum experience. But we're always grappling with that issue, so point well taken.
I'd like to thank you both for showing us two views, the shadowing and the discourse and the videotaping as means of gathering data. But for Colette, I'd like to ask, rather than what's next, what was the process that preceded this type of investigation?
Well, what's next is working with the exhibition. I mean, trying to identify what could improve the functioning of the visitor. I mean, improve what he's thinking, what he's feeling, and what he's imagining. And we discovered that using one's imagination during a visit is one of the factors that increase the number of objects that the visitor is looking at, but also the length of the discourses. And it's imagination, it's the starting point for creativity and for everything that the visitor could bring from himself. So for us, we discovered that, not for us, but we discovered that it's one of the most important resource of the visitor. And our next question was, how could we improve the use of the visitor's imagination? And working especially with the temporary exhibition, I mean the thematic temporary exhibition, we discovered that the coherence of the exhibit, when I say coherence, it seems to be very abstract and very general, but in fact, the coherence of an exhibition is translated in lots of rules. It's all the relationship between the elements used in an exhibition. It could be the objects, their placement in the space, but it's also the text, the relationship between the label and what the visitor could see, but also the relationship between the hierarchy of the text, but also the relationship, I would say, horizontal kind of a relationship. So it's very complex. And when you have this kind of coherence, the visitor not only pick facts, pick information, but it builds up. Like when somebody is building a puzzle, playing with a puzzle. I mean, he takes a piece, he adds a second piece, and he produces a small island around the first piece. And he goes to the next one, and he aggregates that. And at the end, he understands. And he understands most of the time of what he is taking in. So when a visitor understands, and that we could check it, when a visitor understands, he starts adding something from himself. I mean, he could use his imagination. To be very quick is what I would say. And now we are starting to work on the permanent exhibition, because the problem is very, very different. Up until now, with the permanent exhibition, we discovered that there are at least two big problems that a visitor, I mean the general public type of visitor, faces. First, and we all know that, it's that he knows very little about the object. Rarely the general public knows quite a lot about the objects that we are exhibiting. But the second one is that our text, especially the panels, are so reduced that the visitor doesn't have any direction to start meaning making. It's completely open. It's like being in the middle of Washington and saying, where do I go now? What do I want to discover? And a visitor with in a museum which is, in his mind, a very important, very, how could I say it? It's a place like a university, so it's a place for learning. So he says, well, there is certainly something important in this subject. What do they want me to think? So it's wide open. So he doesn't know how to start and in which direction, using his own resources. So I think it's two big problems, and we are starting discovering some new juicy ones. Sorry, somebody was saying, does it happen, I mean, the discourses of type 6, does it happen with scientific exhibitions? I could tell that in the case of natural history objects, at the Botanical Garden in Montreal, we had visitors who produced discourses that are more or less equivalent to what I presented with art. I presented only discourses with art because I didn't want to mix the genre because it would be too difficult to compare them. But I remember very well a visitor who was looking at 3 Benedette trees. And he went on the equivalent of what we found in discourse number 6.
Hi. The theme for your presentations today were based on on-site visits. I'm wondering, simply because the Smithsonian is now being led or encouraged to get much more involved and focused on social networking and so forth with our communication out to the public, be it through exhibits or whatever. Can you apply the same 6 strands that you've discussed in the sociocultural themes within the context of social networking and museums as you can with on-site learning?
What a great question. Can I throw it back at you and see, did you, because you thought of this, were there, and you're doing this kind of work, which I'm not actually actively involved in, do you see parallels yourself or suggestions you would make to the rest of us about that?
Well, certainly from a sociocultural, I'm thinking primarily of video gaming as one avenue for where there's research that's gone on and how that whole genre of interaction has spun off into a whole new way of learning, and it's being used in context of academia as well as schools and so forth. I'm not a museologist here, or I'm a librarian, so I'm looking at it from a different point of view in terms of how I might want to interpret this in terms of our websites and what we have in context within our resources that we offer to the public for the libraries. But I'm not sure I could answer that except to say that we hope we could touch upon some of the strands virtually with the motivation and, of course, the further inquiry. And I don't know, is anybody else willing to take that and see where there could be an intersection?
Yeah, because one of the issues seems sort of methodological when you have people interacting in a virtual way, which sounds like a particular interest that you have. You have all these questions that people may, of course, be excited while sitting on their computer, and it's very difficult to tell. So you get into these questions of evidence and also consent, again, if you're trying to study what sorts of evidence you have for these things. I know there's a lot of interest in gaming worlds and virtual networks and how how to capture in any form the kind of learning that is going on there. And a lot of the methods that are being explored have challenges associated with them, either ethical or technical. But I guess I would think that a lot of these might apply equally well and might also scale to larger communities, organizations experiencing some of these things. So I think it's a good thought. Thanks for asking that.
I have a question. One is, Colette, in your presentation you talked a lot about stimulating the imagination and also creativity. And I'm wondering if in the strict 6 strands those might be implied, but are they explicit? And is that also part of learning? Because you think of learning as also the ability to apply that knowledge to a new situation, might be a way that you demonstrate that you now know something. So I was thinking about the connection. Another question I had is, Colette, you talked about that some visitors seem to need more structure, that when they come in to an exhibit, maybe they don't have as much prior knowledge or they're not quite sure how to find their way. And I wondered if you've looked at techniques that the same exhibit could adapt to the needs of people who are at different places within that structure. Are there ways that people can pick up tools or ways of finding way that are more tailored to the different levels?
Well, it's very interesting but very complex question. I'm going to try to review the six aspects regarding the use of imagination. First, excitement and motivation. We discovered that the visitor who use their imagination much compared to the ones who use it very little seem to get motivated by the fact that with the very first artifacts that they deal with, they discover that they could bring something of their own. They could produce something with this object, and we found that it was a motivating factor. When you come to reflect on learning and science and development and identity, I feel that this is evident that imagination is involved quite a lot. Because imagination helps to appropriate the object. Because with the imagination, the visitor picks something he fancies or already knows, or some kind of memories he has. So it means that he makes familiar, he transforms in something familiar, something that he didn't know. So it's very important in the appropriation, but it's also important for the identity. I've been able to do that.
Yeah, I would just chime in. I agree with for me, the strands 3 and 6 both capture that a little bit. The imagination, I think it takes an imagination to ask a question or to wonder about something before you try it. And often people don't say, I wonder what will happen if I put my shoe up to this camera. But there's an implicit mental process, I think, going on there, a sort of unspoken prediction and a wondering what will happen that I think is behind a lot of what makes our places interesting. And then I also agree with Colette there about the identity thing. I think there's a lot of some of the work that Jay Rounds has been writing about recently, about how people go to museums in part to try out identity, the construct of identity as a sort of moment by moment, almost like a piece of clothing that you can try on and see how it fits you. That's an opportunity that museums provide people, and so that can be a really valuable entree into possible activities or careers or interests that people have as that chance to try on an identity in our spaces. So I think imagination is a key point there too.
I might want to answer a question that was asked a few moments ago about, does the visitor transport or use what he did on one object to the next one. And I would say that the answer is usually not. If I would like to make a joke about the visitor, the way he behaves, I would say he is like a hen in the field that picks some maize, pick one bit, then another one, then another one. It's like that. So the visitor doesn't transport from one object to the other what he did on the first one. It's exceptional. And so it's so important to have a very integrated exhibition, I mean a coherent exhibition. Because when your exhibition is coherent, it helps the visitor to use what he did before to treat the next objects. So it's very important. And with the permanent exhibition, what we are trying to find out is how to keep the labels very short, just identifying the object, so the visitor is free.
I'd like to thank both of our presenters for very thought-provoking presentations today. I know it'll lead to a lot more discussion as we're part of our strategic planning process and thinking about what education and learning is here at the Smithsonian. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming out on a rainy day today and joining us. And we look forward to seeing you again at the next Good Lecture Series. Thank you for coming.
I would like to thank you for